So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this Thursday evening. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe and healthy. So, to start us off, we'll begin with the recitation of Surah Fatiha in its English translation. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم. مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praise is for Allah, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Master of the day of judgment, you alone we worship, in you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you're displeased with, or those who are astray. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on today. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Pitten First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pump Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Now, before I pass this mic to our next speaker, I would like to go over a few quick housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. A link will also be sent to all of you following the event. We welcome your questions and comments. There will be a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and you can use the chat function or the Q&A functions to submit your questions, and we will address them after the presentation. Lastly, a post-event survey will be emailed to you later today, and it takes less than 2 minutes to complete, and it helps us plan future events and programming. Now, I would like to welcome our Executive Director, Nuzhat Jaffrey, to introduce our speaker and provide a brief background about the series. Thank you.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our July edition of the Muslim Women Scholar Series, Muslim Women Scholar Series. And today's topic is really very, very intriguing and interesting. So the title of today's seminar is Now You See Me, Examining the Sartorial Practices of Migrant Muslim Women in Canada. So why do we do this Muslim Women's Scholar Series? CCMW started to do this a few years ago because one of our strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. One way of doing this is to feature the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars focusing on diverse topics related to Muslim women. And we are delighted this evening to introduce you to our presenter, our scholar, Rihab Muhammad Patel. Rihab is a scholar artist and PhD candidate in sociology at Carleton University, whose research explores the intersections of art, identity, and resistance in Muslim communities. Her work focuses on how Muslim artists use creative practices, including digital art, fashion, storytelling, and AI, to challenge Islamophobia and imagine alternative futures. With a background in fashion studies and a master's thesis titled Now You See Me, Rehab critically examines the visibility of Muslim women through dress and spatial politics. Her work has been exhibited internationally and featured in museums and academic forums, including the Digital British Islam Conference and the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. Rehab's approach blends ethnography, storytelling, and visual methods to advance conversations around belonging, digital presence, and the future of Muslim representation in Canada. Welcome, Rehab.
Hi guys, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. I'm just gonna go ahead and actually share my screen first before I start really getting into the fun stuff. I see some familiar names, so thank you everyone for joining. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the title of a master's thesis. Yes, Now You See Me. It'll make more sense towards the end, when you realize what it really means to be seen, by the clothes that we wear. And I'll give you guys some definitions throughout. So pretty much this seminar is going to be divided in almost like two parts. First, I'm going to give you a overview of not only my research, but of my future research as well. So it'll give you a breakdown of what my master's of my 2 years kind of consisted, which includes like a research summary, questions, methodology. Hopefully you learn some new definitions that you can incorporate in your own everyday life. And then I'll talk a little bit more of contemporary examples and like the future of my PhD research. So currently, okay, well, I forgot to press next. So here you go. This is a little overview, especially when it comes to my master's thesis and how it relates to the work that I'm doing now and I hope to do. But a little bit more about me is I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University, Ottawa. I have a master's in fashion. Whenever I talk to somebody about oh, I have a master's in fashion. They think high fashion, they think Bella Hadid, they think fast fashion. But the approach that I really took was to look at it through a critical lens about how, yes, Muslims in the fashion industry can be celebrated, but at the same time, it's very important to look at the impact of Islamophobia, gendered Islamophobia specifically, and how like clothing can make us visible and at times put us at risk for violence or like hypervisibility as well. But some of my research interests, as Nazira summarized for you, is also art and resistance, but I like looking at fashion as a form of that as well. Artificial intelligence, AI. There's so much work that I'm doing on AI, which is really intriguing, but I know there are a bit of ethical concerns, which I will also touch a bit on towards the end. So my professional work is I am a community director for MIPSers. They are a Muslims Arts and Culture Collective based in NYC. So I'm their community director here in Canada. I'm also a creative director. I enjoy kind of using color and fashion to tell different types of stories and prompts into it. Finally, I am also a contract instructor at Carleton University. I'm excited to say that I'm teaching an intro to fashion course this fall. So it's fashion, art, and the everyday. So I'm super excited about that. Before I jump into my master's thesis, I'll start off about how I got to where I did. So I started my master's in 2020. It was a virtual master's at this point. And I originally went into the program thinking I wanted to do it on like social media, how Muslim women are dressing on social media. But going forward, I think it was during summer of 2021. I had a proposal ready, and then unfortunately, the London attack happened, and it took me, I think, 2, 3 weeks where I was just like, I need to write about this, right? But I am in a fashion studies program, and it got me thinking. I'm like, yes, this family, they were murdered, they were targeted specifically because they looked Muslim. So, what does a Muslim look like, right? The grandmother, she was wearing shalwar kameez. The mother was wearing a hijab. These became identifiers, right? So their gender was also a important part about the violence that this family experienced. So I do dedicate my master's to the Afzal family, and it really did change the life of many people. But like the words that I have, they're very emotional. But I think in retrospect, that violence has opened eyes to how important it is to look at gender Islamophobia, even in fashion studies. So like I said, cool, fashion is amazing. We can celebrate it, but we can also look at it through a critical lens. If I'm speaking too fast, please let me know. I do have a habit of doing that. So I'll start off with my master's research summary, just so you have an overview of what you're getting into for the next half hour at least. So my master's research examined how young migrant Muslim women in Canada use clothing to navigate and express their identities. So through a critical literature review, semi-structured interviews, and wardrobe interviews, I explored how intersectional factors such as religion, gender, migration, and culture influence their sartorial practices. The findings actually revealed that their dressing practices are shaped not only by gendered Islamophobia, but intra-religious conflict, the need to negotiate visibility in different spaces. So participants often engaged in situational dressing, which is adjusting their clothing based on context, to manage how they were perceived and to resist dominant Western norms. That being said, part of my research, I developed a concept called spatial visibility, which I'll talk about a little bit more towards the end about. Um, so if you're wondering what wardrobe interviews are, so the way the master's was structured was I let out a call for participants. I got some responses, so I did more of a one-on-one, but it was COVID lockdown, unfortunately, so we did a lot more virtual interviews, and I got an insight into their closets. So yes, that's what we also do in research. We look into your closets and judge your clothing. No, I'm joking. We're not going to judge your clothing, but it kind of gives into insight about like the types of clothing you're wearing, and we kind of give prompts to prepare you to show us some of the outfits as well. So these were my main research questions. One was like, how is gendered Islamophobia experienced by young migrant Muslim women through their reactions to their sartorial practices? Two, how do their intersectional identities result in them experience gendered Islamophobia? What role does visibility play in the lives of these migrant Muslim women? And also, how do their sartorial practices impact their lived experiences of belonging in Canada? I do want to mention that I did try to simplify a little bit of my research because it's important to note that not everyone is aware of, I don't want to say jargon, but in an academic tone. So if there are any words that you need clarification for, please hold on to that and write it into the Q&A. I'd love to be able to help simplify and help you understand a bit more. So what did my methodology really look like? So my methodology, I was, like I mentioned, threefold. So first was a critical literature review, and these were the main points that I really looked at. But for today's presentation, I'm going to talk about gendered Islamophobia, sartorial practices in religion, and lived religion. So going a little bit back into the research question, what was really important is that research wanted to really look at the fashion identities, but the fashion expression, like how they were dressing. So part of the call was to have, I'm going to give you a bit of the requirements. So one was they must be between the ages of 18 to 25. Identify as a woman, identify as Muslim, and have a migrancy background. So what does a migrancy background really mean? It really means that either you or somebody in your lineage was a migrant, which in a way, we all are as settlers in Canada. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of dissect three main portions of my literature review. One is gendered Islamophobia. There were many, many scholars that I looked at, but the two key scholars that I really influenced my work was Dr. Jasmine Neat and Dr. Aliyah Mohammed Wilson. And they argued that gender Islamophobia actually operates through the intersections of racism, sexism, and religious discrimination. This targets Muslim women, particularly those who are visibly Muslim through their clothing, like the hijab or the niqab. They highlight how Muslim women tend to be actually hypervisible and invisible, marked as threats of symbols of oppression within public discourse and state policies. So this form of Islamophobia is not really about just religious intolerance, but it's deeply embedded in colonial, orientalist, and patriarchal logics that construct Muslim women as needing to be saved or surveillanced. Their work emphasized that their gendered Islamophobia is both structural and affected in shaping everyday experience of fear, exclusion, and resistance. When I think about gender Islamophobia, I really build on my own lived experiences, and that's how this research really came up to be. Um, So we all know Sephora, right? The nice big beauty brand. I say this story very often. When I started working there in 2016, I want to say in downtown Toronto, you'd assume that they're very diverse. It's Toronto, we know. But I did get a lot of questions about my hijab, particularly whether I was there to judge them. For some reason, they thought that I got hired to judge them, whether they were going to go to hell or not, right? So this really tied into the idea about how my identity as a Muslim woman who wore the hijab, and at that time I used to wear it in a different style, which was the turban hijab. Certainly, pre stereotypes were made about me that I am super religious, that I have certain types of mentality when it came to what it meant to really belong in that sense. And then that kind of ties into the next concept of sartorial practices. I love this concept, but it's almost like a tongue twister, and it does get really tiring to repeat it again and again. So Anna Marie Ilma explores how clothing functions as a powerful medium through which religious identity, gender, and social norms are actually expressed and negotiated. So, what was important about her work is she emphasized that sartorial practices are not merely aesthetics, but they're deeply embedded in our cultural religious frameworks. So, they shape how individuals relate to themselves and are being perceived by others. So, for religious individuals, clothing can signal piety, community belonging, or resistance, especially in contexts where religious expression is falsified or policed. So I want you to think in the meantime, what are your sartorial practices? What you're wearing now, I want to know. Well, we'll say that for Q&A, but think about it. Why did you choose to wear what you wore? What goes through your head when you wake up in the morning and decide to wear, let's say, a white tee and baggy pants? Is it for comfort? Is it that you're going to a certain place and that's more acceptable? So that's really what sartorial practice is. It's not really just about aesthetics, where it could be about aesthetics as well, but it's really about what is influencing your choice in your everyday. That kind of ties a little bit more into Dr. Meredith B. McGuire's concept of lived religion. So, as I have a quick definition also on screen for you. So, lived religion is about how people actually experience and practice their faith in everyday life, and not just in places like mosques or churches, but it's also through daily actions like cooking, dressing, storytelling, and it focuses on real life spirituality rather than official rulings or teachings. The concept of real lived religion really changed my perception of what it meant to be Muslim and how I am constantly existing as a Muslim woman in my everyday life, right? So to kind of simplify it a little bit more, think about lived religion is how you're living within your religious identity away from institutionalized religions, like going to a mosque or going to Sunday school. So, in this paper, or at least in my research, McGuire introduced the concept of lived religion to highlight how people practice and, in a way, experiment religion in everyday life as well. So, she argues that religious life is honestly and very truthfully messy, but it can be really creative. And it's actually embedded, deeply embedded, and seen in actions, emotions, routines, which in this case could also be dressing, but eating or even storytelling. So this approach challenges like very oversimplified, or how we could say top-down definitions of religion, which and centers the agencies of individuals in diverse ways of how they're incorporating spirituality into their daily lives. So again, a little quick moment for reflection for you guys. I want you to think about how you, if you are religious, even if you're non-religious, how you experience that in the everyday. If you are non-religious, do you feel that you are constantly having to practice being a non-religious person that does not identify, say, with a faith group? Or do you see yourself as someone who's like, no, I live by the means of what my institutes have taught me? And that we see in different types of also Muslim communities. So the next portion of my research was for my methodology was actually interviews. So interviews are the best part. As you can tell, I talk a lot. My mom has always told me that I'm meant to be a teacher because I talk a lot. So clearly I'm doing what I love, right? What I'm meant to do. But yes, so interviews. So it was 5 one-on-one interviews with people who responded to my call. And they come from all different cultural backgrounds, and many were actually from different Muslim sects as well. So the first picture I have on here, it's an image showcasing one of my participants. So all the names in this research have been changed for anonymity as well. So the first image is actually Razia's everyday attire, and it was actually taken from her personal archive. She's wearing a loose pair of terracotta trousers paired with a white sweater, and on top she's layered a long coat and her usual hijab that she lays loosely around her head and neck. What's funny about this, because again, this was around 2022 and Razia's outfit has completely changed. Razia's, sorry. She actually reached out and we were talking a little bit about it. And yeah, it's slightly changed, still about comfort, but it's changed a bit more. The second image here is Liza. It's from her personal archives as well. She's wearing a plaid skirt with stockings, and which he also has a black crop turtleneck. And it's more of a casual late night out outfit. So one thing you're probably wondering, and this actually came up during my defense, was like, there's a variety of how Muslim women dress, that not all Muslim women are wearing hijabs, and some of them dress not so modestly. So if you're curious about that, don't worry, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the second half of the seminar. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about my findings, specifically the key 4 findings. So the first one is about adaptability and code switching. So participants use adaptability and code switching in their sartorial practices to navigate different cultural, religious, and social spaces. So they modified their clothing based on the context, such as safety, belonging, respect, or showing how garments became tools to manage identity and perception. So Sarah, one of my participants, Sarah, she said that she blended a lot more of her Western and modest styles depending on her environment, while Lisa adjusted her outfits to avoid cultural conflict, highlighting how fashion is actually flexible, is a flexible strategy for navigating and avoiding cultural conflicts. So this kind of like, despite not being able to control other people's biases, these choices gave the participants a sense of agency of how they were seen. A really interesting conversation that came up with my participant Liza was to avoid cultural conflict. What does that really mean, right? About how, for her, growing up in a religious Sunni household, she was she was taught in a way not to wear certain clothes because they were seen immodest, or more specifically, what other people were saying. So it kind of drove away from a religious perspective and went into a cultural idea of like, what will other people say? Why are you wearing this? Your legs are showing. So she's like, you know what? It's just better not to argue sometimes, and it's easier to wear something a bit more convenient per se. Um, the secondary trauma and the fear of gender Islamophobia was an important concept that really came up because, yes, a part of the paper was to look at gender Islamophobia as a whole. But it was really about the fear of experiencing gender Islamophobia. This might just be my dark humor, but sometimes I joke about it. I'm like, okay, maybe I don't want to wear that because I don't want to be hate crimed, right? Because being hate crime is a very real experience and it happens, right? An experience that I use is when I used to wear my hijab in the turban hijab, a lot more people thought wearing it in that style was acceptable. And to me, it also felt acceptable because it's like, okay, to me, it's a religious marker, but at the same time, if it's into these Western norms, so I kind of belong and I fit into the situation. But while I was doing my undergrad and my master's at TMU, I think this was during my undergrad, I used to have a habit of going on campus quite early in the morning. So I think this was around 8 a.m. I got out of the subway on Dundas and Yonge and I went to cross the street and I had my headphones on and I noticed that people were looking at me and I just couldn't understand why. So I took off my headphones and I realized there was a man across the street yelling at me saying like he was going to punch me in the face. And I was like, oh, He's talking to me because he pointed out my pink hijab, and I was so happy to wear that pink hijab. It was like my favorite one. And I stopped wearing it because it was like, oh, well, it's making me stand out. And apparently I will stand out regardless of how I wear my hijab, right? Unfortunately, in that moment, nobody really did anything. They just continued to walk across the street, and I kind of went the opposite way because I was like 19 years old. I didn't really want to get into it with a 6'5" man telling me he was going to punch me in the face, right? So one of my other participants, Hila, her story was that her mom was actually scared to send her to work because she's had family and friends who told their kids to stop wearing the hijab due to the fear of Islamophobia. Because of everything that's happening, and during this time was, well, Trump's bad, but during Trump's time then too was the Muslim ban, and everywhere you look, like Muslims are being hurt in Palestine, Syria, India, and the hate is rising. And I feel like even though it isn't direct, I can still experience it. And what's really unfortunate, I guess, in a more contemporary aspect is this research was done in 2021, and it's still the same if you notice for Palestine, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in India as well. So this section really explored how Muslim women experience a secondary trauma response, a constant underlying fear of Islamophobic violence that shapes how they dress and move through public spaces. So the visibility of this Muslim identity, especially the visibility of Muslim identity, especially through clothing like the hijab, can heighten vulnerability to discrimination or violence, as seen in the aftermath of the 2021 London, Ontario van attack. So participants in the study actually experienced the fear of not only for themselves, but their fellow people, but for family, friends, and often strangers as well. So often like adapting their clothing to appear less Muslim in certain settings. These situation practices like wearing a beanie instead of a hijab reflect the emotional toll of Islamophobia, where Muslim women internalize societal surveillance and modify their appearance as a coping strategy. And the story that I told you really after that as well, very often whenever I would take the Toronto Transportation TTC, I would wear a beanie. Or if I had my hijab on, I would put a beanie on top of it and then a hoodie on top, so you couldn't really see my hijab at the same time. So this is where the intersection of like why your sartorial practices are coming in as well. So the last two parts of or findings of my research was intra-religious conflict and challenging Western norms. When it came to talking about intra-religious conflicts, I believe, and this is again from my lived experiences, a lot of communities don't really talk about it when it comes to what it means to feel like you're not belonging within a Muslim community, right? Because you're like, well, Muslims should be one on that, then why do you feel like you don't belong? And it was really unfortunate to hear some of my participants really talk about this part, specifically about as children, they were labeled as the other, they were labeled as violent as well. So one of my participants, Lisa, she said a class clown in grade 9, he was being so rowdy, turned to me and said, so you guys beat yourselves. So you guys hurt yourselves with knives. She's like, I hope I see this online, but people don't say it to me directly. But then he said, I Shia people, and I hope Shia people die. And that, if you think about when you're in grade 9, you must be 13 to hear that. But she also said that she wasn't surprised. So a 13-year-old wasn't surprised by feeling like she doesn't belong, but also being a direct target to such violent thoughts. My other participant also, she comes from a Ahmadi community, and she mentioned it as well. Like sometimes she's really afraid that people are going to find out that she's Ahmadi, especially when she goes to like say fellow Muslim friends' houses or anything like that, or even if it's a mosque and she's like, okay, I need to catch my prayer, I need to go into the mosque, but then she's like, I always have to think about like, am I safe in this mosque as a Ahmadi Muslim? Same thing with the Shia participant who's like, well, am I safe as a Shia? So this section really highlighted how inter-religious conflicts impacts Muslim minorities like Shia and Ahmadi Muslims, Ismaili Muslims who face discrimination not only just from a broader society, but within Muslim communities. So participants shared experiences of fear, exclusion, and having to adapt their clothing or identity to avoid hostility. So Razia, one of the participants, is an Ahmadi Muslim, and she described changing her dress in non-Ahmadi areas due to the visibility of the burqa coat. So she said that a lot of people in her community wore a long, it's like a long coat that also mimics a little bit of a burqa, and it became an identifier within the community as well. So my other participant, Lisa, actually recalled being, again, verbally attacked. And these stories changed the idea of what it means to be a singular Muslim identity, right? And it really shows how religion is lived and experienced in very diverse ways and personal ways. So this ends up tying really close to the concept of lived religion beyond institutional definitions. And the final concept was challenging Western norms. And this is what's really been influencing how I also live my personal life. So one of my participants, Sarah, she talked, part of her experience was it ranges from different types of Islamophobia. Sometimes it's so casual. Why are you wearing it this way? Versus something more violent, like a text. So she recalls in the summer of 2021 where she was out with her friends. So she says, I was out with my hijabi friends from Ontario, and she was actually from Quebec at this time. So we all wore it, the hijab, traditionally. So more of the way that I'm wearing it. And we were waiting for parking, and we got into an argument with someone in another car, and the French-speaking lady yelled in French something along the lines of, "It's common for you people." So in this way, I guess whatever scenario placed, they were not only targeted, it like what felt to Sarah was she was targeted because they were visible Muslim women, and they were all from different ethnic backgrounds. So it wasn't like she was targeting her because she's South Asian and someone else is Arab. Somebody was a white convert there. No, they were all um, kind of stereotyped into this idea of being rowdy and unreasonable because they wear the hijab. So this section really emphasized how clothing, particularly the hijab, is a everyday form of resistance against Western systems. Because as my participant Sarah later mentioned, was like, sometimes I wear the hijab as a, middle finger to Islamophobes because you think you can challenge what I can and what I can't wear versus I can wear what I want to wear, right? So it becomes not only a think about like a tool to resist in their family or their cultures, but what it means to belong in a society, particularly the everyday. So drawing on historical examples like Algerian and Palestinian women who use veiling as actual anti-colonial resistance. Participants in the study actually described how wearing the hijab today can reclaim agency in a climate of Islamophobia and racial othering. So, despite experiences of both overt and covert discriminations, participants like Sarah and Lisa emphasize the power of embracing their cultural and religious identity. For them, resistance isn't always loud. It can be found in the act of simply existing as they are in spaces trying to make them invisible. I do want to preface this by saying, I know it's coming off as like, okay, the hijab is resistance, but as we know, cross-culturally, the hijab is also used as a tool of oppression for other Muslim women around the world. So whether to put on or to take off the hijab, it really depends on the context, right? For some, taking off the hijab and being able to choose not to wear it is a form of resistance, versus in places like, I want to say, the West, or even in certain places in India as well, wearing the hijab is a sign of resistance. Something exciting, what really came up through these findings was developing a concept of spatial visibility. So in simple terms, beyond the constraints of identity biases, spaces are the basis of heightening visibility. So this concept is developed and is currently being developed furthermore to describe how how Muslim women's identities are becoming more visible or hypervisible. So depending on the spaces that they're in. So I use an image of the mosque as an example, which I'll expand on in a bit. So participants often share that their clothing choices change based on the locations they work, right? Like the public transit system, workplaces, or white dominant neighborhoods where they felt like they were at a risk of being targeted. Visibility wasn't always just tied to religious dress, but it also came to names, having a Muslim name, or their skin tone or other cultural markers as well. So this emerging concept highlighted how certain spaces intensify perceptions of otherness, shaping how Muslim women navigate their identities through dress. So in simple terms, what really came across is, well, a mosque is ideally a symbol of the Muslim faith, right? A lot of people go to mosque to learn about Islam, to kind of show their devotion as well. So being at a mosque would make somebody a Muslim, right? Like that is the overall assumption or the association with Islam and Muslims. This, I think, unfortunately, ties well with the 2019, I believe it was 2019 Quebec mosque shooting, about how all the Muslim men there were violently attacked and many were killed, many were injured. Why? Because they were at a mosque. The assumption was they're at a mosque, so they must be Muslim. So the mosque as a space made somebody's identity hyper visible. In this context, made their religious identities as Muslims hyper visible. And this could be used in different spaces as well, but I use it again more for Muslim women and the idea of, like, say, traveling and transforming. So while they're traveling on, say, the TTC, unfortunately, it's become a place where you meet interesting people and sometimes you might not feel safe. So I go back to that example of me wearing the beanie when I used to take the subway. So in that moment, the subway, the TTC at, say, 9 p.m. made me a little bit more hypervisible. And this can be used in different contexts, right? So if we go back to my participant, Razia, who talks about being a Ahmadi Muslim, right? So that was through her burqa clothing and what space made her Ahmadi identity a bit more visible. Similarly, we can talk a little bit about Lisa and her Shia identity. What part of her clothing made her Shia identity more visible? In this sense, she talked about wearing the sword of Ali, Zulfiqar, on her neck. So she's like wearing that. And if I were to go, say, to a predominantly Sunni mosque, I became very hyper Shia in that sense. So let me see. Okay, so a part of this, what really came out of this research was constantly hearing conversations around how Muslim women were dressing and its association with modest fashion. So, like I mentioned some of my participants as well, not all of them dressed what we would say modestly, but does that take away from their Muslim identity? So that kind of develops into the second part of the seminar about Muslim fashion and modest fashion. So the way I differentiate and talk about it, oh, if this part's really interesting to you, I believe CCMW is doing a work conference in November, which I will be hosting a little panel as well, which we'll talk a little bit more about Muslim fashion, modest fashion in the workplace. But I'm going to go ahead and dissect both these definitions for you. So Muslim fashion refers to how Muslims who identify with the Islamic faith choose to dress in ways that reflect their cultural, gender, personal preferences, and everyday realities. So it's not solely about just religion or modesty, but rather a diverse and evolving expression of identity shaped by many intersecting factors. So in contrast, modest fashion is a broader trend that focuses on piety, for some, piety, being covered or less revealing clothing, which can be worn by many people that are not only just Muslim with or associated with any faith. While many um, say modest companies actually target Muslims, as we know, modesty isn't just associated with Islam. So while Muslim fashion may include modest styles, it's not defined or limited by them. An example I would use is on social media right now, or there always has been a trend about what it meant to dress modestly, some of the inspirations. So this is Lena Assad. She is a, I believe, half white and half Palestinian content creator in the States, I believe Dallas, if I'm not mistaken. And she started her journey on social media by being a Muslim woman. And during that time, it was like, wow, Muslim women can be on social media. They can do makeup, they can dress. That's crazy. I wouldn't have imagined. That's wild, right? But that's really how she built her following by sharing her love of fashion, her outfits, and then it went to vlogs about her everyday, her family, her sisters, and she kind of built her own little empire as well. So she created the brand Ella the Label, which is more modest clothing, and it's usually long dresses or long skirts. It's important to note that two of her sisters, Amanda and Lauren, they're also both influencers, don't wear the hijab. So a lot of the dresses are shown as being styled in modest ways, but they're not exclusively just for hijabi veiling Muslim women. Versus, I like talking a little bit about Halima Aden, a Somali model. Her story is really interesting because she kind of got scouted at a pageant and she really blew up. But I believe this was around 2020, 2021 as well. She said that she was retiring from fashion and it wasn't something that her heart wasn't anymore. She didn't want to do it anymore. And why was that? Because she realized, well, she said after having conversations with her mother, was her hijab was used almost as an accessory and it took away meaning, religious meaning, that she held deeply. So there's certain images, if you Google, I think Halima Aden jeans, there is a image where there's almost like a pair of jeans styled as her hijab. And she recalls that by saying that I stopped having a say in how my hijab was perceived. And it got to a moment where the hijab wasn't really for me as a Muslim woman, but it was more of an accessory as a token of diversity in the fashion industry. But in the last couple of years, I think she took more of a break and then she came back into the modeling world, into the fashion industry, and reclaimed the hijab as her own. So where she's like, well, if I'm going to be a model or if I'm going to be representing the hijab, I want it to be done on my own terms and not used as just a fancy prop or an accessory. So I like talking a little bit more about how it's important to differentiate when we think about fashions and Muslims, because often, like I said, when I started my master's or when I tell somebody I have a master's in fashion, they're constantly thinking about high fashion. But what about the everyday? So we kind of go back into the affects of clothes. But when we think about fashion in say a larger perspective, what we see on social media, what we see in magazines and movies, it also changes our perception of who is a Muslim, right? Who is a Muslim woman, who isn't? Because it kind of just ties back to the essence of, well, what makes you a Muslim, right? And a lot of my participants also mentioned this in the research is they felt like they had to answer to somebody, an invisible audience, about what they were wearing, even if they weren't really answering to anyone, right? So on social media, for example, if you go through pages of this Lena's sister, I think her name is Amanda, who doesn't wear the hijab. She is a little bit on the skinnier side. So when she is wearing dresses, people are like, well, that's not modest because it's skinny and it's skin tight. You can't be claiming that's modest because you don't wear the hijab. How come you don't talk about your Muslim identity? So the question is, can Muslims or Muslim women be fashionable within the realm of being a practicing Muslim? This isn't a question for I'm asking you to answer because I don't even have the answer, but we know it really just ties into the agency of like what it means to dress and why we're dressing, right? It's intent. And I always go back to that when I talk to almost anyone, but mostly my participants, about just Islam doesn't navigate who and what you are, but that's a choice between you and your creator and what you're choosing to believe. And that kind of just goes back to having the agency to dress the way you should dress. Some of the future work I really want to talk about when it comes to fashion is fashion as resistance, artistic resistance in this particular context. So fashion has become a very vital form of artistic resistance against Islamophobia. So it allows Muslim designers, artists, and everyday individuals to challenge misrepresentation through visual and symbolic expressions. So clothing serves not only as a cultural identifier, but also a political statement. For example, the keffiyeh and the watermelon symbols of Palestinian resistance have widely been used in fashion now to express solidarity, protests against colonial violence, and anti-Muslim racism. So Muslim creatives also use garments, prints, styling to confront stereotypes of oppression. And and for some people, reclaiming modesty as empowerment rather than limitation. Unfortunately, I am chronically online, so there's this trend going right now about decentering yourself from the male gaze and what it means to that. And while I was scrolling through TikTok, many times that really came across was women being like, I want to dress for myself. I don't want to dress for the male gaze anymore. And very valid. And it's really interesting to see how that narrative has been changing about who you're dressing for. So when I talk about artistic resistance, there is a concept in art called the third space, right? So what is really the third space? Think about, I'm going to explain it in my way and how I view fashion as a middle ground. Um, when you think about art, it's in two folds. One, what is being perceived, right, by the audience, and what you as an artist aim to have somebody perceive. Wait, no, that didn't make sense. Let me go back. Okay. One, as an artist, what you're choosing to present and hoping people will perceive. And secondly, how the audience will perceive it, right? So why do you think art galleries are so much fun to go into, right? Because you get to make meaning of the art, and sometimes you can feel emotion, you can feel what the artist is saying, but sometimes it leaves you conflicted of being like, see, like this feels very dark and harrowing to me, versus the artist is like, really? It was supposed to bring joy. So we become the third space. And that's where fashion really comes into place, about what you're choosing to wear and how people are going to see you. So sometimes I literally dress because I enjoy color. I like pastels. I like wearing a peach job. And someone's going to be like, wow, you look really stylish today. I'm like, really? This is just a casual outfit that I put together, and it fit because to me, it was modest and it was more convenient, right? So style to them is something completely different. Um, but I want to talk a little bit about my artistic work that kind of ties into this as well. So there is a project that I did with the MIPSers called Khwab. So the word Khwab, here you go. The word Khwab in Urdu means to dream, what it means to dream and reimagine. In this specific project, I wanted to recreate alter egos of Muslim women. So ending up my master's, during my defense, the last question I had from one of my supervisors was, okay, what do you want to do, Rahab? What do you want to be? And I jokingly said like, oh, I want to be a superhero. And then he was like, you already are. And I'm like, haha. And when I closed my virtual defense, I'm like, wait, I can't be a superhero. I can make myself into one, but how am I going to create myself into an alter ego? So I reached out to the Mipster saying, hey, I have an idea. Can we talk? And that's what we did. So we create a photo series. So in this photo series, it was to look at the intersection of fashion, art, and technology, right? And to reimagine Muslim futurism. So Muslim futurism as a concept is to reimagine Muslim identity without the constraints of hegemonic, what's it called, oppression, anti-colonial, what do you say? Sorry, anti-colonial policies and regulations as well, anti-Black racism as well. So it's really to give agency back about how you can imagine a utopia. This kind of refers back to, actually, the term comes from Afrofuturism, where Mark Derry talks about the intersection of art, race, and technology. But here I'm using Muslim futurism to really understand beyond a fiction element, right? But for the project to Khwab to dream, it was like, okay, dream about your alter ego. What would you be if we couldn't think in a like box? So I want to ask you guys, like, what would your alter ego be, right? An example, you're like, okay, well, I would be, I don't know, a mermaid. It's like, amazing. Why a mermaid? Add elements to it. I want to know, I want to get into the nitty-gritty part of it. I need you to dissect it. I want to know a little bit more on why and what you would be. And I think it just kind of goes back into the ability to think about the future is very privileged as well, especially when it comes to the idea of, especially when it ties into fictionality, right? To imagine a world that's fictional, that is utopia, is so privileged, especially when we're faced with the horrid reality of what's happening in the world right now, right? So fashion is not only used as resistance, but as an escape as well, and what it means to be able to present themselves. So a little bit about these participants in this photo series. There was 5 people in there. So that scary looking person is me. That was my alter ego. So when I said I wanted to be a superhero, I thought about the realities of it. And again, this was around 2022 as well. Um, when I put on the mask, and I'm like, okay, think about it. Let's really think about it. Imagine a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, who's covered her face, is running around beating up bad guys. I'm not going to be labeled a hero. I'm going to be labeled, let's say, a terrorist. And it's like, no, no, that's not. But it is. A good example that I use is my mom who wears the niqab as well, right? When she started wearing the niqab, we were actually all worried for her as well about like, okay, what type of Islamophobia will she experience as well? But it kind of goes back into I chose to be a superhero, but I in a way be perceived as an anti-hero, and that's who I kind of became in my alter ego. My other participant, her name is Suka. She's actually a fashion influencer as well. She wears scarves on her heads, but she says there's not hijabs. The call for participants here was someone who identifies as Muslim. So two or three of my participants actually came and they're like, we don't know if we really belong in this project because we're more so culturally Muslim. And I'm like, listen, I'm not here holding a weight scale of saying how Muslim you are or not. This is like your call. And they decided that, yeah, we are Muslim or we are culturally Muslim and we want to be included and kind of reimagine what it means to be an alter ego, right? So Suka says she wanted to be a warrior, underwater warrior. And I believe elements were like having octopus hands. And it was because she's like, the more hands I have, the more people I can help. And she talks about being from a marginalized community and being a warrior meant like strength to her. So it was really interesting to see how not only just fashion, but fashion and art really are used, were used by these participants from their lived experiences to reimagine a future where that was more hopeful and joyous as well. If you're more curious to learn a little bit more about the project, if you type in Mipster's Fob, you should be able to find it. I do have an article out on the Fashion Studies Journal as well. Here's a little abstract of it that while I was yapping, if you read, if not, again, it's on the website as well. And then that's pretty much it. I wanted to just kind of tie in and thank everyone for joining today. All 35 of you. I'm super excited and very thankful for it. The outfit here that I'm wearing is a Palestinian tobe by a Palestinian designer who gets her clothing made in Jordan as well. I believe the company's name is Zain Tob. If you're curious and you want to follow along my journey, you can either email me, you can follow me on X or Instagram as well. And I do have some future work coming up. I have a paper in the works in which will hopefully be published by end of year called The Algorithm as an Archivist, the Use of AI by Muslim Digital Artists. And that's in the Journal for the Study of Religious Experience. And I will be an exhibition creator at the Carleton University Art Gallery next fall. And the work I'll be creating is with a local Somali artist, Fazia Omar, that takes photographs as photo series and photo voices for the experience for Somali diaspora. And that's it on my end, and thank you so much.
Great. Zainab, did you have your hand up? Or it came down? Okay, so I think we can begin. Thank you so much, Rehab. That was so interesting. I mean, as you were presenting, I had lots of questions in my head, but then I said, no, this is for our audience, so let's see if we have questions. So we have she's saying, Rizwana is saying, not a question, but just want to share that I have used content from Mipsters when constructing PD, professional development on Islamophobia for educators. That's good, Rizwana. Thanks for sharing that. Any questions, comments? You can also use the raise hand feature. If you like, we can find you and you can, if you want, you can unmute and turn on your camera and it would be nice to see you. So, anyone, any questions?
If
Okay.
anyone doesn't have a question, I'd like for you guys to share your alter egos. So that'd be nice as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sana Patel has a question for you. Amazing work. I'm wondering how participants were chosen to be interviewed. Rehab, could you please talk a little bit about recruitment?
Yeah, if you're talking about it in my master's perspective, sorry, for my master's paper, the participants were, it was a open call, so it was through a snowballing effect where I shared it on social media and it was mostly from word of mouth. And it is important to note that it was during a COVID lockdown, so there was a lot more restrictions on how I could find fellow participants as well. So it was really done through social media and word of mouth. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Mhm. Next question is from Olaj, asking, did your research cover the relationship Muslim women have with beauty?
Not per se. I think when a lot of my participants really were talking more about their sartorial practices, which includes clothing and less so about beauty. But this concept is what I actually want to include in my PhD research about how we define fashion, right? And fashion, is it just solely clothing, garments, or does it also include accessories, accessorizing the bodies? Because as we see, like artist fashion is also seen through tattooing, piercings. So that's something that I hope to explore a little bit more.
Okay, well, we have a comment in the Q&A box. Kind of fun. This is from Zed, who's saying, my alter ego would be a Bollywood megastar. Ha. If
Would
only
you have any type of superpowers or something different? Come on, like you can be a Bollywood megastar. I'm pretty sure is that just on its own as well.
I was going to ask you, I mean, this is a huge topic, and it's interesting how you're talking about fashion, which is really helpful because people assume when they talk about fashion, they are talking about high fashion. But really, from what you're saying, it is, um, yeah, it's an everyday thing, why you dress, what you dress in, um, and why you choose the clothes you choose. But
Mhm.
but it's a fashion that is reflected from the person, like their fashion, as
Mhm.
opposed to, what people um like what people first look at visually and then say, oh, that's really nice. I'd like to wear that. Or that is high fashion. That is what's in vogue these days. So I thought it was really interesting that you made that distinction, and it's helpful. So we have a comment here, a fantastic presentation, a lot of new Muslim info for me. Um, for example, Mipsters and Mapstar? No, I don't know about that. Youth are such change makers. Indeed, they are. And excellent presentation. That's another comment.
So if you're curious about the word mipsters, it actually comes from Muslim hipster, so it's mipsters.
There you go.
Mhm.
Yes, it's a great one. Um, so one other thing that I find, okay, we have a good question here. You mentioned wearing hijab under a hoodie. Um, did you find it's common to camouflage a hijab?
Yeah, actually for not even just my participants, but average Muslim women as well, camouflaging the hijab it became like a very common and almost unintentional practice. Another example of that would be like when they would travel, for example, with the global tensions for like say crossing the borders or even right now going into the States, instead of wearing say per a traditional hijab, it might be worn in a different style or a hoodie just for more convenience sake as well. So unfortunately, I have been noticing a little bit more that it's becoming a common practice amongst not only Muslim women, but people of other faith groups as well. I know there was a gentleman who wore the turban as well. He was Sikh and he was saying, yeah, sometimes when I'm traveling to the States, I actually just don't wear my turban because it's just easier. And then he's like, when I get to the washroom, I just go ahead and put it on after he crosses the border customs. And he's like, I'll go into the washroom and put my turban back on.
Okay, there are two questions, one from the Q&A. Um, I would like to hear your thoughts on how veiling Muslim women and not and even non-veiling women, Muslim or not, can assert themselves and their identity in the context of gendered Islamophobia in Quebec, having Bill 21 in mind, disproportionately affects veiling Muslim women. What I mean is, how do we resist this kind of oppression?
Yeah. So, what I say is like existence is resistance, right? In my lecture when I was teaching Intro to Sociology, we had a week on social movements, and it was like, how do social movements start? Um, you telling somebody next to you about an issue is the start of a social movement. That's advocacy right there, right? So with Bill 21 as well, when I heard about it, it felt like almost like a direct attack because I do want to be an educator, right? I am a professor here at Carleton, a contract instructor, but if I cross the border and go to Quebec, can I go and teach at public schools, government funded schools? Can I? No, right? So me telling, for example, my classroom of 300 students, that example was a form of advocacy of them being like, oh, what do you mean? Like if you drive 20 minutes down this little bridge that we have into Gatineau that you can't teach. So it's really, if you think about, like, I think, unfortunately, as a sociologist, I say that it is very much the start of a lot of discrimination that you see, right? Because we see this polarization of movements of like either where's the far right or the far left, and there is no middle ground. What does that really mean? It heightens a lot of emotions where people feel like they don't belong in certain places. So I think examples of Bill 21 in this particular sense is there is no of saying that, oh, I'm a Muslim woman, it affects me, and it only affects me, because it doesn't only affect Muslim women, right? It also affects people of other faith groups as well. So advocacy or resistance is existence. You acknowledge the existence of one, that these policies place are discriminatory and they are unfair, they're unjust, right? So you acknowledge that existence, and then you acknowledge, well, there are people who belong in these spaces who do veil, and for some they might wear a turban, some might wear a kippah, and these are other religious identity markers, and they belong in these spaces. I hope that kind of answers your question as well.
Thank you. That's a great answer. So an excellent presentations from Samina. She's saying, are there any clothing recycling programs in the projects described?
So I I think the best description I would have for this is upcycling. It's not really a program, but a lot of the participants and just people in general say it's easier to upcycle your clothing and to layer, right? So instead of having to buy a new dress all the time, it's like, how do you accessorize? And I think about it through my fashion identity and how I wear clothes. To make outfits modest is it becomes a skill, because right now it's summer and I want something that's comfy and convenient, but if I go into the mall I'll find sleeveless stuff. It's like, okay, do I just wear a long sleeve, or how do I make it more say adjustable to how I my fashionable identity, for example, right? So it wasn't really to recycle, but we really talked more about what it meant to style as well, and why they were styling. And again, and that went into the code switching part of the research. But not in my master's, but amongst my undergraduate students, a lot of the younger generation are more aware of what fast fashion is. And it's not just per se about consuming fast fashion, but it's also the influence of social media and virality as well, about why people are showcasing massive hauls about wearing clothes, and would somebody who can't afford to wear clothes be able to wear fast fashion, and what it means to have affordable clothing as well. And can they wear recyclable clothes, some from the thrift store, or kind of passing it down as well. I hope that was an okay answer.
Thank you. It's an interesting question for sure. Here's a question from Naz. She's asking, have you researched and identified any competitive monitoring, not policing, among Muslim women regarding our fashion choices and as a force that drives markets and fashion trends?
I want to say yes. So This is just again me being a sociologist of even when I'm trying to doom scroll on social media, like a lot of the patterns that we see, I can't unsee, right? So yes, modest clothing is a thing, but then you see companies like, for example, Shein, right? Which is a fast fashion brand of all of a sudden being like, we have abayas for you. And you'll see other brands during, say, Ramadan or Eid, and even a lot of brands that particularly have a history of being Islamophobic and super racist coming out with collections that are aimed and targeted to Muslims, Muslim women. And I know earlier this year during Ramadan on social media, you see people being like, "Oh, look at H&M's Eid collection." People are, well, like H&M historically hasn't been a ally to Muslims and other marginalized groups. Same thing with Zara, but all of a sudden they have clothing that are targeted, and they might be using, say, certain collaborators, influencers to kind of push these images about, look, we have clothing that are more accessible. So I want to say, like, if we take a step back, it also jumps into this conversation about like having accessible clothing and who is creating these clothing, right? Having modest options or clothing that can be targeted to Muslims should be accessible, but who's it coming from, right? Because right now, if you Google a modest dress and you want to buy not from Shein, not from H&M, all of a sudden they're going to cost 80 to 90 bucks. And it's like, okay, well, I don't have 90 bucks to just like dish out on one single dress as well, right? So it goes into affordability as well.
I have this is just a, an observation. I think this sort of sudden availability of things like abaya and longer dresses, full sleeve dresses. I think a lot of it may be because there's a demand for it, particularly in very, very wealthy, Muslim majority countries. They have the money, and they go shopping. It's a
Designer abayas, right? You have, I've seen abayas. I think Versace made abaya. No, Dolce Gabbana has made abayas too.
So, and if you've ever been to the Gulf states and you go to the mall, you look at the abayas worn and then, the sequins and I mean, it's really interesting uh, because you don't know what they're wearing underneath. But I know from like discussions and families where, outwardly they're wearing abayas, but, when you take it off, they're wearing very fashionable clothes, no sleeves, plunging necklines, lots of jewelry, makeup. So it's interesting how they navigate that,
Mhm.
the external presentation and the presentation within a group, family, or among, other women. And
Mhm.
I've seen that certainly in Arab families. I haven't seen it so much in South Asian families. I mean, yes, the women will get together and they'll do their own thing, but there's a lot of mixture of what the women wear. And also, one question I have for you, because it's always intrigued me. You see, I, I'm really old, so I've lived through many, many, many fashion trends, even in, among Muslims. So I remember my grandmother. My grandmother used to, wear a dupatta
Mhm.
very loosely, on her head, swung over her shoulder. And when she prayed, she would sort of wrap it and, say her prayers. But it was not the hijab of today, with the head
Mhm.
completely covered, like, and then, and it was more like the women in Iran sort of wear the scarf, and some Afghan women wear it that way too. And then my mother did not wear like she would just wear one sort of around her neck, a scarf around her neck. But when she went to study, she was still studying when she had me. I was a child, but I saw her get dressed to go outside. So what she would wear is sort of like a short coat that was to her knees, and then a scarf that had a trans like a veil that she would put over her head when she was, out on a bus or something. But otherwise, she wouldn't. She would have it up so people could see her face. So that was a very different form of dress. I haven't seen much of that. Um, and so she was modest in her own ways
Mhm.
in her dress, and it was very spatial. Like, where was she? when she put the veil down? Where was she when she put it up? Did she have it on at all? So I saw many different ways of Muslim women dressing. But when she came here, my mother came here, she, in those days, this was in, the early 60s, you could not get a job
Mhm.
wearing anything other than a skirt. So for her, it was like mortifying, but she had to wear a skirt because that's what was acceptable, to go to work. And so she went through sort of an evolution. And at that time for her, it was survival
Mhm.
and, being able to support my father in making a living here. So they accepted it. They wore what they could, but she was still very observant about, you know, um, how long the skirt was, whether she would have full sleeves or not. So I'm just saying to you that today's description of what is a hijab, because there is no such thing as a hijab that is prescribed. It is,
Mhm.
covering your head, niqab, that covers part of your face. So I just wanted to ask you, in your study and in your research, did you look at the evolution, of that fashion? Because that's what it is. Because for me, it wasn't, none of the pieces around resistance or anything had any meaning for my grandmother or my mother.
Mhm.
They did what was customary, and what was required, what was needed, like you said. Um, and so I wonder what, if you discuss that or if you looked at the historical trends and how Muslim women actually have evolved and how they express their modesty.
I will say this much that my work didn't really look too much into the historical context because my focal point was mostly on how clothing and Islamophobia kind of play a role in one another, right? But what you're saying is really interesting. I will say, like, my mother, she's in her 60s and she actually started wearing the niqab like a couple years back, and this was during COVID, and she was like, well, everyone else is wearing a mask, let me wear it too, right? And we told her, well, like, you're a little bit older, you don't have to. And she's like, no, I want to do this. And which is funny because she actually lived in Saudi Arabia at the time, and when we talk about religion, she always says, like, like, we were younger and we grew up in a so-called religious state like Saudi Arabia. She lived in Jeddah, where, well, it was supposed to be like an ideal Muslim woman. She's like, we weren't that religious. She's like, we didn't wear hijabs. Probably, again, we just wore it as a veil when we walked out and stuff. And then she's like, I started wearing the hijab when I came to Canada, right? And then even when she used to work at a factory, sometimes she would wear shirts that were a bit half sleeved, or sometimes I like her hijab would be a little bit more different. But again, like you said, it was about survival, right? About like being able to provide, and there was no concept of like Islamophobia in her choice about like this is. But then as she got older, she realized like I can make choices, but I also have the privilege to make these choices, right? So when she stopped working, about being at home, and she's like, well, I don't really have to go and get a job and wear the niqab. So her perception completely changed in that sense. I do have young Muslim friends who do wear the full niqab and burqa, and they actually work in Muslim organizations, and they've worked in non-Muslim organizations as well, but they're like, it's just easier where I don't have to justify my being constantly. So for some, yes, it could be just a sense of survival when it comes to veiling and unveiling as well, right? But that's very interesting. My research didn't look at that, but I'll definitely take note of that to maybe include that in some of my PhD dissertation as well.
Yeah, I would really, because again, we come from South Asian backgrounds, and
Mhm.
the thing that amazes me is the variety of fashion, in South Asia. And of course, at the heart of it, sometimes, it's you may not call it modest, but the fact is that the at the heart of it, like the long flowing pants or gararas, or even a sari with a longer blouse that hides your midriff. I mean, all of that is part of the modest, you know, fashion. And so it's a combination of comfort and modesty, because something like a gharara is probably one of the most comfortable pants you can wear, right? So
Right.
anyway, what I'm saying is I think there's lots of fascination for me in the variety of clothes that Muslim women wear in different parts of the world, and how that has historically changed would be really interesting to look at.
I was thinking about something while you said, what comes to mind is also about who it's modest for, right? Like who is championing this definition of modesty? Because in some of my research and again my observations is modesty as a concept changes, right? Because for women who are a little bit more, say, curvy or busty, they might be wearing the same modest outfits, but it's deemed immodest, right? For what reason? And then if you think about it again, like historically as well, a lot of these again, so taking the same example about like someone who's more of a curvy body wanting to wear an abaya, and guess what? Like if she has curves, those curves are going to find a way to show themselves, right? It's they're also for marginalized groups, right? Like what it meant to wear certain types of outfits, like the sari too, right? My dad was telling me about how like I think his great grandma, he can't even remember it, but somebody in your family, they used to wear really traditional Indian clothes, right? And at that time, they used to wear bangles and anklets and stuff. But if you think about it in contemporary ways, it's like, well, it would wearing anklets all of a sudden be modest? Is wearing a sari modest where if your belly shows? But during that time, when we think about the 1900s, that was more of a cultural aspect of it. So does our new understanding of modesty undermine our, say, ancestral understanding of what it meant to be Muslim women? Because to them, they were still Muslim, right? It wasn't that, oh, just because we're wearing a sari that maybe a bit of our stomach shows or our arm shows, that makes us any less Muslim. That's what it brings up. Yeah.
So, we shared the story about our former executive director, Alia Hogbin.
Mhm.
Alia wore a sari all the time. She wore it. That's how I remember her. And I did know her for the last 60 years. I've known Alia. And she used to wear a sari. And then maybe about 2 decades ago, she switched to shalwar kameez. And it was just because she said it's easier, you know? But that's what she wore.
Yeah.
And she didn't do anything else, but she wore beautiful saris. She loved jewelry, and she wore really beautiful jewelry, and she wore shalwar kameez. So she went, no matter who she was meeting with, going to work, anything like that, either the sari before, 2 decades ago, and then following that, she wore shalwar kameez. And so it's interesting because she's a Muslim woman, okay? And people may or may not have known that, but because she became known as a, prominent Muslim woman, who wore a sari, that became sort of like a secondary thing. But
Yeah.
people, because most people assume that, okay, only Hindu women or, women in India wear saris. Well, most South Asian women will, say to you that it's one of the most beautiful dresses, and they wear it when, when and if, it pleases them. So
Yeah.
it's a really interesting idea, and that's why I'm interested in the evolution of what we wear,
Mm.
because, I I can go on with you having this chat, but I don't
Yeah.
want to bore everyone. So, are there any other questions, comments? It was a fascinating presentation, and people are thanking you for the great presentation, and just um, and I think they're very curious now to see your PhD.
Oh. No, but thank you for giving me the opportunity. I think it means quite a lot.
Afua has a comment. So, Afua, do you want to please go ahead and comment? That would be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nuzet, and thanks to Rehab. It's really fascinating presentation. Thank you for that. I was thinking the whole discussion around modesty or modest dress, and you guys have been talking about the cultural aspect, but so perhaps it would be interesting or useful rather to come back to, some of the instructions around dress
Yes.
from the surahs, like Surah Nisa, for example, and other surahs that talk specifically about modesty. So one of the nice things about the Quran, it doesn't say this is how it should be, 10 inches below the knee or what have you. A lot of it is left up to interpretation, but it's good to go back to those Quranic verses. Should women cover their head? Well, there's one surah or an ayah rather that said, draw your veil over your breast. And that has so multiple interpretations because so many people are saying, well, in the time of the Jahiliyyah, women used to go about bare breasts, so it meant just cover your breast, right? Some people are saying, no, it meant bring your veil down from your head to cover your breast. So I think it's useful. And what we think of modesty today or Muslim women's dress or hijab, it's evolutionary, it is historical, it's also cultural. And perhaps we should broaden our perspective because we focus a lot on the Indo-Pakistan world and the Arab world
Yes,
when we're talking about Muslim women,
Yes, you're absolutely right.
outfit, and there's just so much more, right?
Yeah.
'Cause it's such a big it's such a huge ummah, and people are dressing in diverse ways, but at the same time, what would be considered modest. So I was looking at some images of people, in this case women, who went to Hajj during the last quarter of the 19th century. So Arabia was under the Ottoman dominion. So the Ottoman Sultan ordered, and photography was a new technology. So the Sultan ordered that photographs of the pilgrims be taken. Really, really, very nice, very fascinating. You saw how the women dressed then, and completely different from how obviously it would be different. It's over 100 years ago. But at the same time, their dress was considered modest. So it is evolutionary, it is historical, and I understand, Rehab, your focus on clothing and gendered Islamophobia. So that is a context. So I wouldn't send you to go do more work to look at photographs from 1875.
But it would be really interesting for
Yeah.
archival because there isn't like I'll say fashion studies itself is yes evolving, but it's still quite small. Let alone archival research for Muslim fashion. I want to note to what you were saying about like looking at the hadith and everything. You're 100% right on that, but it's also I think in like I look at it through more of a contemporary lens, and a lot of young Muslim women are just like, we want to be able to interpret it, but also to go back to what you were saying about like the Indo-Pak culture, you're right. And I think that's where I was trying to get at about a lot of conversations around modesty are also very anti-Black as well, especially for young Black Muslim women. I have friends who also mention, well, like it's hard for us to find modest clothes, or some things are labeled to us as being immodest, which is like we can't help it. Like we have these features, we can't like do much. But at the same time, if they think about it, about their families in different parts of the world, the clothing that they wear are modest to them, right? And it fit their body types, and people don't do a double take. And I feel like I could give a whole other presentation or write a whole other paper on what it like surrounding modesty and the anti-Black influences that really come alongside that too.
So I think we're almost out of time, but one thing we have to, I mean, I was using those as examples, the women and the South Asian women, but the fact of the matter is Islam is everywhere around the world. A very large number, in fact, the largest Muslim population, on the African continent is in Nigeria, and they have their own dress. It's, and you look at every country where Muslims are present, in a majority or even a minority, the dress across the continent of Africa varies greatly. And then if you go to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, there's a lot of variances too. So that's another topic.
Yeah.
The diversity of Muslim women around the world and how they dress.
Mhm.
But I think, Afua, thank you so much for your comments. And I
Yeah.
would love to look at that image if you want to ever share it with us.
Yeah, I'll have to find it. And I'll send it to you, Nazette. But I also want to quickly say that there has been a quote unquote Arabization of fashion
Mhm.
in many African countries, because I was also looking at pictures of Somali women in the 1970s, and their dress, modest, different. More and more people now are wearing the abaya. I went into the highlands of Guinea, where I have ancestry, and there are women there in niqab, and I'm like, this is so interesting, right? Niqab, long black abaya, and so
Well, that's
people
very,
are reinterpreting modesty. Let me say
uh,
that.
and
Yeah, I'm keeping a note of all this. I'm just like, when I
uh,
have a moment, I want to write papers on this.
so I
Yeah.
agree with you 100%, Afua. Um, that there has been an Arabization of Muslim clothing. The first time I saw that the kind of hijab that most women wear now, the one that, covers the hair completely and then puts then you put on a scarf like you have, Rihab, was when I saw it in my in-laws. They're Lebanese. And the older ladies sometimes wore it. Well, when they went for Hajj and they came back, then they started to wear it. But that was the first time I saw that kind of head covering. I'd never seen it before because I described what I had seen. Anyway, we're at the end of our evening. It was such a fascinating discussion, and Rehab has put her contact information. Is it okay?
Let
C
me,
email at Carlton?
yeah, I'll just quickly share this page if that's easier.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can blow it up a bit. Um, so thank you so much, Rehab.
Thank
And
you so much.
may you all have a stormy night out there. I heard thunder. I
Yeah.
don't know where everybody is in across the country, but there are storms happening
Yeah.
right now down here. And you can hear it, you can probably experience it shortly. But thank you, Rehab, for a fascinating and interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. And hopefully, when you come to speak at our conference in November, you're going to generate more discussion. So anyone who's here, we're going to put a plug in for our November employment conference. Please go to our website, register for the conference taking place here in Toronto on November 6th and 7th. It's going to be a very, very important conference on the topic of Muslim women's employment and the challenges they face, but also what helps them, in their work and advancing their careers. With that, I shall say goodbye, and may
You.
God guide you and keep you safe. And inshallah, we'll see you at our next Muslim Women's Scholar Series, yet to be scheduled, but I'm sure equally interesting. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Take care.